Streaming from Abbey Cat Recording Studio in Chicago.
You are listening to Influenced, a podcast where we explore what makes great music influential.
I'd like to welcome everybody to this episode of Influenced. It's our podcast here with Robert Dean
and Blake Sokoloff. It's where we trace influence and lineage of various bands throughout rock and pop music history and kind of trace who influenced them and who they influenced and where the music comes from.
This week, we're obviously focusing in on Brian Jonestown Massacre.
Yeah, they're a group primarily formed in the late 80s band led by prolific and controversial figure Anton Newcombe, whose temper is kind of just as well known as the band's music, if not even more so, partly due to the pretty successful documentary that came out about the band about a decade ago called Dig, that kind of traces their relationship with Dandy Warhols and a couple other music industry figures at the time, and traces the rise and fall of both the Brian Jonestown Massacre and the Dandy Warhols, and really shows you it's definitely one of the better music documentaries that exists out there, and kind of shows you the difference between a band that's a cult, just like a cult fascination, and something that's actually kind of starting to gain momentum with the Dandy Warhols. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting documentary, and definitely one of the reasons that a lot of people know about the Brian Jonestown Massacre today. We're not here to talk about their antics. We're here to talk about their music.
Well, you can't totally you can't single one out. You can't
totally separate the two.
Yeah, we definitely want to talk about the music. I was wondering where you were going to go with all that around Anton, but if we have any listeners who haven't seen Dig, Blake and I would highly recommend giving that a view. It's really
definitely. And so the Brian Jonestown Massacre really formed in San Francisco in the late 80s as kind of a way for Anton Newcombe to get out his musical ambitions, and he spent a lot of the late 80s and early 90s just kind of being fascinated by the British shoegaze and noise rock scenes, and being really influenced by bands like the Jesus and Mary Chain and My Bloody Valentine. Even some more niche bands like Swervedriver and Slowdive and stuff like that. I was a follower of Anton Newcombe's on Twitter for a while, and he would pretty often just talk about little tidbits of his musical journey, and just his influences on a lot of just the music that made him who he was. And I remember him talking about pretty often, saw a Slowdive concert on their earliest tour of the U.S. in probably 1990 or 1991. And he said, according to him, he was on 100 sheets of acid, which is pretty much impossible for any living human
being. Yeah.
So I'm sure that's some sort of exaggeration, but it definitely, that kind of dreamy, ethereal, and very dense music was a very big influence on the early works of the Brian Jonestown Massacre. This is a track from the first album that was kind of one of the first commercially available releases from the Brian Jonestown Massacre, and it's this song's called Evergreen.
A man
So you can really hear the just like shoegaze and noise rock influence in their early work. That was just like very washed out and distorted electric guitars, and the super dreamy mix of like female and male vocals is definitely a trick straight out of the Slowdive or My Bloody Valentine rule book. And so in the early days, they were definitely very, very inspired by that kind of musical trend in the late 80s and early 90s. And after a few years of kind of chasing that shoegaze sound and that very dreamy and nostalgic sound, he did a little bit of a 180. Anton did, I guess. And after kind of finding more consistent lineup of the Brian Jonestown Massacre, because the band has always shifted around very, very heavily. And like it really just revolves around Anton and some of his closest crew of friends. But in the mid 90s, he kind of found a group of people that he trusted to play his songs, and a couple people that he liked writing songs with, like a guitarist named Jeff Davies and another musician named Matt Hollywood, who actually sings lead and writes a few Brian Jonestown Massacre songs himself. They all very much really started getting obsessed with recreating that like 60s and 70s like style of like music that Anton felt like had kind of gotten lost to the years with just like everything, all the technological breakthroughs in the music industry and stuff that had happened in the last few years. And they started taking influence from bands like their namesake Brian Jones band, the Rolling Stones. Like you'll hear Painted Black in just a second. And also a lot of other 60s bands like the Byrds and the Who and West Coast pop art experimental bands and even more niche bands like that.
I see a red door and I want it painted black. No colors anymore, I want them to turn black. I see the girls walk by dressed in their summer clothes. I have to turn my head until my darkness goes.
Got very, very obsessed recreating that 60s sound with like a lot of albums that they released in a very, very quick succession in the early and mid 90s. I think between the years of like 1994 and 1996, they released something like 4 albums, written, recorded, and like finished in that time frame. So in the span of almost a year and a half, he released like almost 50 songs. And they were all kind of different takes on that like 60s sound. Like this is a cut from album, I think the 1995 album Take It From the Man, which features a massive just like British Union Jack on the album cover, as kind of an homage to their very, very British influence at the time.
And you can really hear some of those early bands. I definitely hear the Stones in this song in particular.
Definitely, yeah. Just like the guitar interplay and the vocals are very, very Stones-esque.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think about the Stooges as an influence as well?
Oh yeah, they're definitely just like a lot of the proto-punk-esque bands of the like late 60s and early 70s are definitely huge influences. Like the Stooges and the Velvet Underground and bands like that are definitely huge influences on like the Brian Jonestown Massacre.
So messed up, I want you here. In my room, I want you here.
especially what they were doing with like very, very 60s rock influenced music in the mid 90s. The Iggy Pop and the Stooges were definitely huge. And even the way that they would like approach their audiences at shows, and like they were very confrontational live. Often shows with the Brian Jonestown Massacre would end with like band fighting or
Exactly.
like fighting the audience, or just crazy shenanigans going off. So there's definitely a lot of that like we don't give a shit attitude was pretty prevalent with a lot of those like proto punk bands as well. That definitely played a big role in the Brian Jonestown Massacre.
Yeah.
But and they've had like a pretty storied history with like members of people, just people being in that band or playing with that band. Like one of the I believe the guitarists on this record from Take It to the Man, or actually I'm sorry, it's on the one of the guitarists who played on the next record after Take It to the Man, which is called Give It Back, is Peter Hayes, who would go on to form the band Black Rebel Motorcycle Club. It's that the playing in the Brian Jonestown Massacre is kind of how Peter Hayes really learned like what being in a band was about, and I think he was beginning to play with Black Rebel Motorcycle Club at the time of that he was in Brian Jonestown, but that's definitely like a big influence on the Black Rebel Motorcycle Club's music, and just like Peter Hayes probably learned a lot of what not to do with during his time with the Brian Jonestown Massacre, and that definitely helped in the beginning of BRMC just keep the band together and keep it a little bit less crazy than
a little more civil.
Yeah, a little more civil than the Brian Jonestown Massacre, but it was definitely a very eye-opening experience and a very creative experience for him playing and being in the band. I know they occasionally still talk to this day, so it's not like the relationship was totally soured with Anton, but a number of other notable musicians have worked with Anton, and like I know one of the frontmen of the kind of seminal shoegaze band RIDE.
The sun will blind my eyes. I love you anyway. Thirsty for your
played on a Brian Jonestown Massacre album. I think it was one of the later albums that came out in like the 2000s. But he was a pretty noted collaborator of Anton Newcombe's for a while, Mark Gardner, and he played guitar and I think sang on a couple of Brian Jonestown Massacre songs. Anton Newcombe has a habit of finding these people just that he admires and people that he knows are very, very talented. And actually, even the first Brian Jonestown Massacre record has the drummer, one of the drummers for the British band Swervedriver. Anton accidentally stumbled upon that guy like hanging out in San Francisco one day, and kind of drafted him into his band. Maybe he was just like, hey man, just come jam with me one day. And that guy wound up in the band for a few months. So Anton definitely has even though he might be a kind of a crazy frontman who is nearly impossible to work with, there's a lot of very, very high quality musicians and people who do choose to work with him, maybe because like, while he might be kind of a crazy person, maybe the quality of the art that he can create is worth it to work with him if every now and again you got to put up with some tantrums.
Yeah, and you
But-
know, it's kind of twofold. You know, he's a great eye for talent, ear for talent, I guess,
Definitely.
and also, you know, it's a great opportunity for somebody who doesn't have a big career going yet to, you know, get some exposure and then potentially go on and do other things. And Anton has been able to kind of recreate over the years and hasn't let that stop him.
Definitely.
So it's a different model, but it certainly, I think they have a total of, or he has a total of 13 LPs,
Oh,
something
yeah.
along that
Oh,
line.
yeah.
So, I mean, you know, he's doing something right.
Definitely. And I know a lot of the people that kind of currently play in the Brian Jonestown Massacre, because I think at the current day, because they do still occasionally tour and record, but I think for the most part nowadays it's mostly like a group of just like session musicians and friends of Anton's who play in other like psychedelic rock bands and stuff, who kind of come together every now and again to tour as the Brian Jonestown Massacre and support Anton. And there's definitely a big community of people who have latched onto his music and kind of continually support him and like the band, their presence, because they have been, over the past few years, they've kind of just grown in popularity since the 90s, because they've kind of become like one of the ultimate cult bands, because they just have this just such a wild just story about their music, and the personalities are there. So there's always that chance of, if you go to a Brian Jonestown Massacre show, you might get to see some crazy stuff go down on stage. So that definitely helps their draw and kind of appeal. So definitely a place for them in the music world these days for the Brian Jonestown Massacre. And they've also like influenced a number of like current like independent and just like some of even the larger alternative rock bands that have come out in the last few years have definitely been noted Brian Jonestown Massacre fans and influences. Like I know the both frontmen of the Libertines, Pete Doherty and Carl Barat, are very, very like outspoken in their admiration of the Brian Jonestown Massacre.
What you gonna do, Katie? You're a sweet, sweet girl, but it's a cruel, cruel world, cruel, cruel world. My pins are none too strong, Katie. Hurry up, Mrs. Brown. I can feel it coming down, and it won't take none too long.
They can be such a like shambolic band almost and still put out such great work. And like in their recording run in the 90s is pretty incredible, with them putting out like 4 or 5 albums in the span of a year. And if you like look in like just the span of like what they did from like 1992 to like the end of the 1990s, they put out so much, potentially even like 100 songs in that decade, which is pretty incredible. So like they've definitely like, there's a lot of like the newer independent artists like the Libertines and other bands like Jake Bugg, and even artists like I know I've seen other contemporaries and bands like the Beechwood Sparks.
Yeah, I mean, you were just talking about the '90s for Brian Jonestown, and I mean that's probably one of the more impressive creative stretches for a guy like Anton, and you know, and obviously the musicians around him, but for his ability to kind of pull that off, it's kind of amazing.
Definitely. And they're like the Black Angels were the band I
okay.
blanked on there for a second. But
What can you tell? A wish from a spell, a hug from a line. They both make you feel so gone. We want you from home again. You're beating hearts again. Bing bang love in June. I heard it from you.
I mean, the Brian Jonestown Massacre have definitely set like a massive precedent in like the kind of psychedelic rock scene. And I know like the Black Angels head up Austin Psych Fest every year, or I think it's now called Levitation. I know the in like 2016 or 17, the Brian Jonestown Massacre were one of the storied headliners of that like festival, and every year that festival kind of makes a point to have their headliners be these acts that have kind of inspired dozens of musicians and just like become these like kind of pillars of like alternative and indie rock and stuff like that. So like when bands like the Black Angels and like a newer psychedelic rock bands like Temples and even like Tame Impala can talk about like the influence that like the Brian Jonestown Massacre had on their, maybe it's just their early work with some bands like Tame Impala and stuff who have kind of drifted away from that like raw psychedelic rock sound, but just the fact that that music did have an influence on their work is definitely is a very big testament to the band in general and their ability to always push forward. And like while they got kind of mostly known for their ability to like create the best 60s music that wasn't from the 60s, they've also like incorporated a lot of styles and other types of genres, and like even as far as like in the later 2000s on music on albums like Revelation, in like kind of bringing around a more electronic influence, and even like having a lot of songs that are maybe there's not any guitar in the songs, and maybe it's all synthesizers and drum machines and sequencers and samples. The fact that they're kind of willing to work with any medium and can still create these great rock songs and great pop songs is definitely a very telling thing about their just influence and the way that they can kind of connect with people and their ability to make incredible art out of like a very fraught atmosphere, so to speak.
You think it's kind of like a willingness to recreate themselves, or is that kind of
I think it is kind of a willingness to kind of always be recreating themselves and experimenting with what kind of boundaries they can push as a band, and kind of as a vessel for Anton Newcombe's sort of creative drive and creative ambition. So they and I also think as kind of Anton's age, because he's not necessarily a young man anymore. I think he's gotten more and more open to collaboration. Like I think there was always kind of a tense, in the early years of the Brian Jonestown Massacre, there was always kind of some tension because the only reason there were a lot of players in that band was physically because Anton couldn't play everything all at once. And now that music technology is at the point where Anton kind of could play everything all at once if he wanted to, I think he's kind of learned that, he does enjoy the collaboration. And he's also in his later years has started to act as a little bit more of an actual producer himself. And he's worked with a lot of other singers and bands as a producer behind the scenes. So he's definitely learning to collaborate.
Yeah, I wonder how that is to have Anton producing your music.
It's probably a little intense, I'd imagine, but I bet you walk away with some pretty spectacular results.
I'd have to agree. And
he's always kind of cooking up something around the corner. I know when he was active on social media, he talks about whenever he says the next time he has like an idea that he thinks is really, really something, he's gonna hook up with the producer Tony Visconti, who produced a lot of David Bowie's like kind of seminal work, and as I guess decent friends with Anton, and so next time Anton has an idea that he feels like is really worth recording and really worth putting out into the world, he's going to work with Tony Visconti, and we might see something in the next few years of that collaboration, and maybe he'll kind of take the Brian Jonestown Massacre up to the next level with that.
Well, hopefully that happens. That would be unbelievable.
Yeah, it would be a pretty sweet. I just wanted to kind of talk about their influence in this band has also had a lot of influence on my personal art and the music that I've made throughout my life. So yeah, I wanted to kind of share that with everyone. And the Brian Jonestown Massacre, I think we kind of more or less covered.
Yeah, I think so. They're coming up on 30 years.
Yeah.
They've had an opportunity to influence, including you.
Yeah,
which I knew.
yeah,
That's pretty special. So
definitely, they're a very, very interesting group with quite a storied history and a lot of really, really great tracks.
awesome.
So to close out today's episode, I think I'm gonna play a track from one of their more recent endeavors. It's come from what they called their mini album Thingy Wingy, but this song is called Fish. It was released in 2016 by the Brian Jonestown Massacre. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been Influenced.
You know my soul.